I'm going to show you an interview that occurred probably about 4 years ago. And I'm going to be talking about a noted journalist, lawyer, civil rights leader, and esteemed professor who grew up during the Jim Crow era and the bitter decades of segregation here in America. You're going to hear in his own words exactly what he and millions of other black people had to endure in this nation. You better think about this, my brothers and sisters, when you go to the polls to vote in November. You can go ahead and vote for Donald Trump if you want to, and the miserable entire Republican Party, because you keep forgetting there's more than the presidency at stake. He'll have the opportunity, if he wins, to appoint more racist judges on the Supreme Court. Senators are up for grabs as well. Congressmen, congressional districts are up for grabs. So let me read to you from the interviewer, David Hoffman, and I quote, "As my subscribers know, this is David Hoffman speaking. I have done thousands of interviews in my life. This interview with journalist, civil rights advocate, lawyer Roger Wilkins was one that I never forget. I asked him to be straight and honest with me and to speak to his grandchildren in the future of his experiences. This is exactly what he did, with such intensity and clarity. He describes living in the South, Jim Crow laws and behaviors in ways that are visceral. You can see it in his face and feel it in his words. There are some commentators," Hoffman stated, "on this video who feel that it's time to forget the past and move to the present, and that reliving the past continues to heighten resentments that are no longer relevant." Let me interject this here and say I'm so tired of people who never had to endure racism and prejudice and bigotry, shame, humiliation, and was spit on and despised, telling us as black people to forget about it. I remember growing up listening to the horrible stories that my grandmother and family members told me about the deep South and all the things that they had to encounter and deal with. So I don't want to hear about get over it. You don't tell other nationalities to get over it who had horrible experiences. No one is telling them to forget what they had to deal with and their suffrage at the hands of their oppressors. They only want to tell black people to forget about it because in this nation, we're still despised. People can come from other countries and other nations and they're welcomed with open arms. And they're told not to integrate with, nor mingle, talk to, nor respect us as a people. They come in our communities, they integrate from all around the nation. Just look at the complexity of neighborhoods. They resemble nothing of us anymore. And then they have the nerve to look down upon us. Check out this video. Let me read this one thing here. So there are those who want us to forget our history. Not happening. Roger Wilkins was a prominent civil rights leader, journalist, and professor of history and American culture at George Mason University. He was a key player in the civil rights movement and worked as an assistant attorney general during the Johnson administration, where he was instrumental in implementing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Wilkins was also a respected journalist and won a Pulitzer Prize for national reporting in 1972 for his coverage of the Watergate scandal as a Washington Post reporter. He later served as the editorial page editor for the New York Times and wrote numerous articles and books on race, politics, and history. Wilkins had a complicated relationship with President John Kennedy. While he respected Kennedy's commitment to civil rights, he was critical of what he saw as the president's inaction on the issue. In his memoir, quote, A Man's Life and Autobiography, close quote, Wilkins wrote that he was disappointed with Kennedy's slow response to the civil rights movement, particularly during the Freedom Rise and the Birmingham campaign. He believed that Kennedy was too callous and too cautious and hesitant to take bold action on civil rights, and that his administration was more concerned with maintaining political power than advancing the cause of racial equality. Wilkins also criticized Kennedy's handling of the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis, arguing that the president's aggressive foreign policy decisions were driven by a desire to prove his toughness rather than a commitment to national security. Despite his criticism of Kennedy, Wilkins ultimately recognized the president's important contributions to the civil rights movement, particularly in his support of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The experience that Rogers is describing is part of our history, part of the history of America. And it is also true, as some commentators have said, that this is not the only relevant history, this negative, painful, somewhat horrible history. There are also beautiful moments in the history of America at this time and with people of all colors and ethnicities. I know because this is the author, the brother who did the interview. I've interviewed people who have lived some of it. So let's get to part one of the interview with Roger Wilkins in his own words. I want you to hear from him.
I used to be a runner in high school and college, and in my late 30s, I began to jog. Early wave of joggers, one of the most foolish things I ever did. And I was jogging near my house in Washington. I was an assistant attorney general of the United States, the best friend of the attorney general of the United States. I was jogging near my house. And a police kind of came by. Fortunately, I had my Justice Department credentials in my hip pocket. Boy, I kept on jogging. My hair was beginning to gray, and I'm jogging along. Boy, I keep on jogging. Hey, you boy! Spotlight on me. Boy, you better stop! The guy better stop. And so I stopped, and two white cops get out, slam me up against a wall, spread my legs, and then spray my legs, hit me pretty hard between the legs, and it hurt very much. I kept saying, look in my back pocket, reach in my back pocket. Boy, we're gonna, you robbed a store, boy this, boy that, boy. They pulled out this thing, and it was a nice leather thing that said I was a Justice Department official. Oh, they melted. Oh, you look just like, we had a call, you just like, it fits you too, sir, blah, 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 blah. Well, of course, I called the police chief the minute I got home, and those guys were suspended and disciplined. If I had had no credentials in my pocket, I would have been in jail that night. Middle class, 37-year-old father of two children, doing nothing more than jogging. And that's not the only time it happened to me. Well, if it would happen to me, imagine what would happen to a 17-year-old black kid in the inner city.
The man speaking is
This
Roger
is the
Wilkins.
interviewer speaking here.
I'm David Hoffman, and I filmed this interview with Roger back in 1989. And this 72-year-old man is telling me of his experiences growing up in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s. He had a really tough time. Although he came from a middle-class family, became a lawyer, actually won a Pulitzer Prize, working for the Washington Post as a journalist with Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, the famous Watergate investigation. So I'm interviewing Roger in 1989, and we really hit it off. He was ready to talk, and I was ready to ask. And I said to him, be yourself. Just let me know what you felt, what you saw, and think about it in terms of future generations. He had a daughter, Elizabeth, and he said, I'm going to talk like I'm talking to her grandchildren. So here we are in the present with all that's going on in the country right now, the racial animosity, stuff in the streets, the government, the desire to make things better. And I'm thinking of Roger. He died at 74 of dementia, and he was speaking to me at that time for the future. We're in the future. I hope you enjoy or find provocative what Roger had to say.
In the bad smell. There were a couple of notorious lynchings in Mississippi. A black kid named Emmett Till whistled at a white woman. They killed him.
Never forget it.
A black guy named Mac Charles Parker, who was accused of having raped a white woman, taken out of jail, killed, thrown in the river. I think both those guys were thrown in the river. Blacks were routinely pulled out of cars and beaten up by state troopers all throughout the South. Black poverty was just horrible. It was being shown in magazines. And then the Supreme Court decided that it was unconstitutional for states to run segregated school systems. And little cute, clean, starched black kids began to show up on people's television screens, being walked to school by their parents and screamed at by white people. The contrast could not have been more stark. The white people who were screaming were, the caricature is the people, working class people, not terribly clean. Some of them obese, faces distorted with anger. Screaming obscenities at 6, 7-year-old children. Well, television was new, everybody was glued to it. That was one. Two, the country had fought this fight for democracy. Blacks felt it, whites felt it, and blacks were restless. Sitting on the back of the bus, being relegated to the upper floor of a theater, and sometimes to only one row of the theater. Going to a gas station when your bladder was full and not knowing whether you'd be permitted to use the bathroom. Having white people be just as rude to you as they chose to be, giving you absolutely no respect. Not being able to try on clothes that you bought at stores, all of that stuff, and worse was going on. And Northerners knew it, and they had tried kind of to avoid it. But when blacks started taking their children to school, the North could no longer avoid the stinking, rotting fruit. And the South was represented by some of the most unattractive people in the Congress. Senator Theodore G. Bilbo of Mississippi was just an awful human being. And there were a lot of Southerners in the House who just spewed bile. And so the North couldn't see it anymore. And blacks began to get hope from the fact that the Supreme Court had finally said, and blacks interpreted this 54 decision to mean that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution include us. Just as we've always said, all God's children are equal. And so we started to move. And white people thought, that's right. And a lot of white people joined in.
You sound like you're talking about sort of the continuation of the Civil War, the way you describe it, although it's like...
Segregation and the legalized oppression of black people was a continuation by the white South of the Civil War. That's exactly what it was. It was taking out on black people their venom against the white Northerners, and saying, you may think that you took our way of life away from us, but you're wrong, and your foolish social theories are wrong too. So it was a continuation of the Civil War, there's no question about it.
I want to ask you about some very basic concepts as they were perceived then. Integration. What did integration mean?
Well, integration had another connotation that was, it was squeezed the same way communism squeezed economics out of us. You couldn't say that you wanted integration to be all mixed up because the white Southerners kept on saying, well, all I want to do is sleep with white women. They say, no, we don't want to sleep with white women. Keep your darn women. They're not that cute anyway. We don't want them. What we want is good educations for our children. And I think that integration for us meant freedom from oppression. I don't think that black people really thought of joining the country club or this or that. They thought, get rid of this humiliation. First of all, get some equal education for our children. That everybody knew. That was a goal. Get equal education because that's our future. But don't tell me I can't go to the bathroom anymore. Don't tell me I can't sit anywhere on the bus or in the theater. Don't tell me that. It's just too terrible. I don't think it was a positive thing. I just think it was get rid of all of this oppression. I mean, you cannot understand how horrible it was to have to contemplate a trip south. And the third thing was freedom from fear of being injured in the South. But a trip to the South for a Northerner was fraught with peril because you were worried that you'd run out of gas and some person would be violent to you and you have no recourse to the law because the law was totally unfair. And then once you got to the town where you were going to be, if you're wise, you had made arrangements to stay with friends because you couldn't stay at the local hotel. And there was often no public place to eat. Well, we want to be rid of all of that stuff. I think if I thought about it, I would have thought that white people's bad views of black people are based on ignorance. And when we get together, they will cease to be ignorant about us, and the scales will fall from their eyes, and they will begin to be decent. That's what I thought. I was pretty naive, but that's what I thought. I think that black people were always super Americans. We had to believe in America more than other people.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to leave it right here for tonight. I will record part 2, or rather, I'll play part 2 of this interview later on. For now, I'm Tyrone Bowman. Never surrender. Never quit.